Picture this. It's roughly 10,000 BC. You're a teenager. Well, sort of. The concept doesn't exist yet, but you're somewhere between 12 and 16. You can run, hunt, carry a spear, and process more sensory information per second than any smartphone ever built. You wake up before dawn in a cave that smells like smoke and wet animal hide, and your father tells you to stay close to camp today. Don't wander. Don't go past the ridge. Come back before dark. And something in you, some quiet, stubborn, absolutely non-negotiable something, says no. Not out loud. Not yet. But the thought is there. The pull toward the ridge is there. The sense that you know something your father doesn't, or that you need to find out for yourself, or that his rules belong to his world, and you're starting to suspect you might need your own. That feeling right there, the one that has gotten teenagers grounded, disowned, celebrated, and occasionally exiled for the entirety of human history. Where did it come from? How old is it? And here's the question nobody actually stops to ask. When did humans first start growing out of it? Because here's what we assume. We assume that at some point, there's a finish line. You hit a certain age, you stop obeying your parents, you become your own person, done. Clean, linear, obvious. The kind of developmental arc you'd put on a motivational poster. But the actual answer, the one that comes from anthropology, neuroscience, and about 100,000 years of messy human evidence, is so much weirder and more interesting than that. Because the truth is, the age at which humans stopped deferring to their parents has not been stable. It has not been universal. It has shifted dramatically across cultures, across centuries, across economic systems, and it is shifting right now in ways most people haven't stopped to notice. And the story of why that is starts not with psychology, not with culture, not with some ancient philosopher deciding children should be seen and not heard. It starts with the human brain, specifically with a part of your brain that your parents finished building before you did. A part that, for most of human history, nobody knew existed. And a part whose development timeline might be the single most consequential biological fact about what it means to grow up that almost nobody talks about. Let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. It sits right behind your forehead, and it is essentially the part of your brain that makes you a functioning member of society. Impulse control, long-term planning, risk assessment, the ability to hear your father say, "Don't go past the ridge," and actually process the reasoning behind it rather than just feeling the pull of the ridge. All of that lives here, and here's the part that should genuinely stop you cold. It's the last part of the brain to fully develop. Not by a little, by a lot. Neuroscientists now broadly agree that the prefrontal cortex doesn't reach full maturity until somewhere between 25 and 28 years old, which means that for the better part of a decade after most societies consider you an adult, the biological hardware responsible for weighing consequences and deferring to authority is still under construction. But here's where it gets interesting, because that's not a flaw, that is a feature. Evolutionary biologists have argued for decades that the prolonged developmental window of the human brain is one of the things that makes our species extraordinary. We are born more helpless than almost any other mammal, and we stay developmentally plastic, meaning genuinely changeable, adaptable, open to new information, for longer than any other creature on Earth. That plasticity is what allowed humans to spread across every climate on the planet, to adapt to rainforests and tundras and deserts within the same species. You cannot do that with a brain that locks in early, but plasticity cuts both ways. A brain that's still forming is a brain that's still questioning, still testing, still pushing against the boundaries set by the previous generation to figure out which ones are real and which ones are just habit. And that drive, that compulsive need to find out for yourself, is not a modern teenage attitude problem. It is ancient. It is wired in. It served a genuine survival function in a world where your parents' knowledge was already slightly out of date by the time they passed it to you. Here's what that means in practical terms. Our ancestors didn't experience adolescent rebellion as a social crisis. They built around it. In most hunter-gatherer societies, we have detailed records of young people began operating with significant independence somewhere between 12 and 15. Not full autonomy, but real agency, real stakes, real consequences. The idea that a 20-year-old should still be checking in with their parents before making a major decision would have been genuinely baffling to most humans who have ever lived. The biology was never designed for that arrangement. Which raises an uncomfortable question about how we got here anyway. Here's something that rarely makes it into history classes. For most of recorded human history, childhood didn't end at 18. It ended at an event, a ritual, a marriage, a first kill, a trade, an initiation ceremony that sometimes lasted days and left permanent marks on the body. The specific trigger varied wildly across cultures. The underlying logic was almost always the same. There is a threshold. You cross it, and on the other side, you are no longer under your parents' authority. You are something else entirely. In ancient Rome, the moment was almost bureaucratically precise. A Roman son remained under patria potestas, the legal authority of his father, until the father formally released him or died. On paper, that sounds oppressive. In practice, most Roman sons were operating independently in business, in military service, in political life well before that legal release ever came. The law said one thing, life said another. The gap between them was where actual adulthood happened. In medieval Europe, apprenticeship solved the problem with elegant practicality. A boy of 7 or 8 would leave his parents' home entirely, move into a craftsman's household, and begin a decade-long process of becoming someone useful. By the time he finished, he was in his late teens, economically independent, socially embedded in a guild, and answerable to an entirely different set of authorities than the ones he was born to. His parents' opinions about his life had become largely ceremonial. The Industrial Revolution broke all of this, and not in the direction you might expect. Early industrialization actually pushed children into the workforce younger, not older. 10-year-olds in textile mills, 12-year-olds in mines. The economic logic was brutal and simple. Small hands, low wages, maximum output. Parental authority in that context became almost irrelevant because the factory owned your time before your parents could say anything about it. What changed everything, and this is the part that almost nobody connects, was compulsory education. When governments began requiring children to stay in school through their mid-teens, then later through 18, they created something that had never existed before in human history at scale: a legally enforced extended childhood, a period during which young people were deliberately kept out of the adult economy, kept in institutions designed for their development, and kept, structurally, dependent. The age at which you stopped obeying your parents didn't rise because humans changed. It rose because the system around them changed, and that system is much newer than most people realize. Here's a number that should make you uncomfortable. In Italy, as of the most recent data available, the average age at which young adults leave their parents' home is 31. 31. In Denmark, it's 21. In the United States, it hovers somewhere around 26 and has been creeping upward for a decade. These are not small cultural differences. These are fundamentally different answers to the same question about when a person becomes fully their own. And the instinct is to explain this with culture. Italians are family-oriented, Scandinavians are independent, Americans are somewhere in the middle, deeply confused about which one they're supposed to be. But that explanation, while not entirely wrong, misses something more interesting sitting underneath it. Because when researchers actually dig into why these numbers differ so dramatically, the answer is less about values and more about economics. Housing costs, labor markets, student debt. The specific financial architecture of a society turns out to be one of the most powerful predictors of when young people stop living under their parents' roof. And living under someone's roof and living under someone's authority are not the same thing, but they are very hard to fully separate. In collectivist cultures, Japan, South Korea, much of the Middle East and Latin America, extended family interdependence is not a failure to launch. It is the architecture of adult life. Decisions are made in consultation with parents, not because the adult child lacks autonomy, but because autonomy in that cultural framework is understood as something exercised within relationships rather than apart from them. The Western idea of independence as physical and financial separation from your family of origin is, in global and historical terms, a fairly radical and fairly recent concept. Most humans who have ever lived would find it not admirable but puzzling. Why would you want to be alone? But here is the paradox that nobody talks about directly. In the wealthiest, most individualistic societies on Earth, where the ideology of independence is loudest, young people are actually taking longer to achieve it than ever before. The gap between when the culture says you should be free and when the economics allow you to actually be free has never been wider, which means an entire generation is living inside that gap. technically adult, theoretically autonomous, practically dependent in ways that complicate every conversation about what it means to stop obeying your parents. Because sometimes what looks like obedience is just math. So let's bring this back to you, right now. Today, you probably have a story about your parents. Everyone does. Maybe you left home at 18 and never looked back. Maybe you're 32 and still having Sunday dinners where someone tells you you're doing your life wrong. Maybe you moved out and moved back and moved out again, which according to current census data, makes you statistically normal in a way that would have been unrecognizable to any previous generation of Americans. The specific shape of the story varies. The underlying tension almost never does. Here's what the research actually says about optimal autonomy. Psychologists studying human development have found something that sounds obvious once you hear it, but is almost never discussed openly. The healthiest transitions to independence are not clean breaks. They are gradual, negotiated, mutual. The adult children who report the strongest long-term relationships with their parents are not the ones who obeyed longest or the ones who left hardest. They are the ones who renegotiated, who at some point, implicitly or explicitly, changed the terms, who stopped being a child in their parents' presence and became something harder to categorize, not a dependent, not a stranger, something in between that most languages don't have a single clean word for. And here's the uncomfortable thing sitting underneath all of that. The question of when you stop obeying your parents is really a question about who gets to define your life. And that question has never had a universal answer. Not biologically, not historically, not culturally. The age varies. The trigger varies. The cost of getting it wrong varies enormously depending on where and when and to whom you were born. What doesn't vary is the question itself. Every human being who has ever lived past puberty has felt some version of it. That pull toward the ridge. That moment of looking at the rules you were handed and deciding which ones are yours and which ones belong to someone else's story about who you should be. Your parents got that feeling too. So did theirs. All the way back to a teenager in a cave 10,000 years ago who didn't have a word for autonomy but understood the concept completely the moment his father told him not to go past the ridge. He probably went anyway. And something about the fact that you're here suggests it worked out fine.